Since arriving in Australia in the mid-19th century, the camera has recorded the nation's life. This is the story of some of the most enduring images of the Australian experience, of three men who made them, and of the history captured and created by their photographs. Late in the 1920s, a young Max Dupain stumbled upon the possibility of a future in photography. It was a discovery which began the career of one of Australia's greatest image makers.
I remember going along to see Joe Collins, who was art director of a leading advertising agency at the time. And I stuffed up his office with drawings and photographs and God knows what not. He looked at them and he says, well, your drawings are bloody awful, but the photographs, well, you know, they might work out someday.
Max secured an apprenticeship in a Sydney studio, beginning his career in a highly romanticised photographic world. Under the spell of the English pictorial school, Australian cameras lingered upon the picturesque and sentimental, rarely turning their gaze on the realities of the nation's life.
The early shots of the 30s, where I was somewhat influenced by the pictorial movement, which was to use the camera as something else. If you could make a paintbrush out of it, they'd be happy. We were getting all sorts of evidence from overseas, particularly America and Europe, which indicated that, you know, the camera was coming into its own.
The new photography developed in Germany and quickly caught on elsewhere. It was part of an artistic explosion that was most intense in Berlin, home to the famous Bauhaus school and to a dynamic radical art movement. It was also home to a young man who would become one of Australia's most important photographers.
Berlin was, in a way, the cultural center of the world in many ways, because so many artists and architects and musicians and sculptors came there. And my father had access to many of them, became friends with a great number of them. And I benefited from this wonderful life of this German Republic.
Inspired by the avant-garde, Wolfgang Sievers began taking photographs composed and lit for dramatic effect. But he was also eager to reveal the real-life dramas of contemporary Germany.
I decided to take some photographs to try and illustrate the results of the incredible unemployment and poverty that came through the Depression. I saw this in the tenement houses in back blocks of Berlin. And I saw this dreadful brown stormtroopers destroying Jewish people's shops and being most terrible demonstrations and killings and murder. I saw that with my own eyes. Well, my father said no son of his was going to stay in Germany under the Nazis, so I prepared to migrate to Australia. Why to Australia? Because it was as far away from Europe as possible. I also heard that there were beautiful girls there. The very last moment, I was called up to the Luftwaffe. And that, of course, was an utter catastrophe. Anyway, I was accepted as photographer in the Nazi Luftwaffe. And as I had nothing to lose at all, I had myself paraded to the officer in charge of the barracks. And I said, well, if you force me to serve for 2 years in the Luftwaffe, I will then go to Australia. When war breaks out, I will use everything that you are teaching me against you. With those words, he looked at me, opened the drawer of his desk, put my papers inside and said, 24 hours, piss off. So off I went to Australia. I came straight out of new objectivity into a pictorial salon atmosphere of Australia. I just couldn't believe it. It was like stepping 50 years back into time.
Melbourne on the Yarra, the Henley of the Southern Hemisphere, a mere 100 yards from the heart of an imposing metropolis. St Kilda Road, truly exquisite lined avenues, vying in splendour with the world's most famous boulevards.
Melbourne was shocking. I just couldn't grasp how backward it was. There were mushy gum trees and sentimental portraits. It was unbelievable. And then I met Max Dupain.
Unlike most of his colleagues, Max Dupain, now working in his own studio, was producing images which drew on the very latest photographic ideas. No longer was he using painterly effects. Now his work was bold in its approach to content and characterized by the clean lines and clear lighting favored by modern European photographers.
I thought, there's a man that I know we are speaking the same language. And it was a great relief because I really was desperate. But there was a man I could talk about these things who knew all about it. And we've been on this parallel line all through our lives, always working slightly away from each other, but in a similar philosophical attitude.
He was a great surfer. He'd just come out of the surf and flopped down on the beach, which is a very characteristic Australian way of life. I think I only took 2 shots of that. The low view, of course, gives it this monumental form. And this has been around all over the world, and I suppose it's looked at as a symbol of the Australian way of life, which of course it isn't.
War disrupted the lives of all Australians. Newly arrived from Germany, Wolfgang Sievers was not permitted to enlist for active duty. Instead, he served in the Army Labour Company. Max Dupain joined the Air Force camouflage unit, in which, like many artists, he made his contribution to the war effort.
The war had a pretty devastating effect on all the art fraternity, so-called, being pacifists, born pacifists. I didn't get into the blood and guts stuff, but I saw enough of life during the war to make me realise that the work that we'd been doing in the studio, in the sense of life, you know, just wasn't with it. And when I got back, we started doing other things.
Peace brought new hope to the world, and to Max Dupain a renewed sense of purpose. A government commission sent him around Australia, scouring the continent for images intended to help immigrants understand their new country's way of life. Dupain's audience included an eager young man determined to make himself a future in photography.
And the person I wanted to photograph with, the person I wanted to learn from, was indeed Max Dupain, who I regarded at that point, such as I knew his images, to be the greatest Australian photographer.
Dupain initially had no work to offer. Moore found a position with another Sydney studio, but soon persuaded Max to take him on as an assistant. Promotional and advertising stills, the bread and butter work of Dupain's studio, became David Moore's photographic training ground.
Although I was learning a lot there technically in the studio, there was something missing in my need to photograph. We were making things look better than they were. And I found that in the weekends, I would go out into the depressed area of Sydney and photograph there, because there was reality, and there were people up against the wall. There was no artificiality. It was a tough life out there, in places like Surrey Hills and Redfern. So, as well as trying to document something about the human condition out there in these depressed areas, I was also dealing with the graphic qualities of these areas. Light, telegraph, power poles, things like that, became part of the composition. I used to borrow a speed graphic camera from Max during the weekends, and this was the badge of office of the press photographer, with flash on camera, and the camera was always carried open. And I was photographing children, as I remember, in a back lane in Redfern. And a woman came out of a paling fence doorway, and she physically apprehended me. She grabbed me by the arm and said, "You're from the press, come and photograph this." And I didn't know quite what was happening. And as she led me through, she said, "There's 3 families living in this house. It's been condemned by the council. We have to move, but we've been given no alternative accommodation." She said, "Take a photograph of this." And by this point, we were in the bedroom, and there was a mother in bed with a new baby. And this was what she wanted me to photograph. And I could see in that room, there was a much bigger picture. There was a grandmother at the bottom of the bed, and there was a child on the floor. And it had all the elements of poverty in Sydney in the 1940s. So I took two exposures. And as soon as I left, I was overcome with a feeling of guilt that I'd been in there under false pretenses, that I wasn't a press photographer, and I had no way of having that photograph published. So when Max came in, I said, "Max, I feel I should destroy these negatives." And he said, "No, don't destroy them." So I wrote a long letter to the council, included a photograph, and suggested that maybe the situation of these people should be reconsidered by the council. And in that way, I guess I eased my conscience about the images. But at the same time I was doing these pictures in the depressed areas of Sydney, I was also fascinated by the city, by the financial heart of Sydney, where there was a drive and an energy, and money was the big motivating force.
All work and no play is no way to live. I think you might have forgotten how to take a holiday. This is a map. You use it to find places. This is a beach towel. You lie on it. This is your family. Remember them? So what are you waiting for? Go on, get out there. See Australia!
Millions of people have looked into her eyes, yet she doesn't even know that this image exists. A modern-day Mona Lisa, simply known as Afghan Girl. She appeared on the cover of our magazine over 17 years ago, and we've been searching for her ever since. Now, incredibly, we have found her. Search for the Afghan Girl, an exclusive premiere tomorrow at 8:30, only on National Geographic Channel.
Australia prospered in the post-war period. Increases in population and affluence after long years of depression and war gave the nation's industries a new lease of life.
I had thought, to hell with it. I'll go right into industry where I can apply all I had learned at Bauhaus, the purity of design, the machine, the honesty. And I loved that. Now, we'll start talking a little bit, how did I approach working in these factories? This is what's so important, to be able to have the brains to concentrate in discovering what is the essence of a factory like that. Now, the essence of a textile factory, of a good one, is a loom tuner, the man that makes sure that everything in weaving is as it ought to be. That man, to concentrate on him, not to photograph the machine, but the man that directs this machine. And it is done, of course, with the simplest of means, my usual technique of using the minimum of floodlights to emphasize what is really important. The human element had always attracted me. I was scared of it because I had to learn to deal with people. But slowly I became more and more accustomed to it. As my English improved, I could talk better to people. Later on, of course, it was also a great advantage to be able to speak other languages, because so many of the workers in Australian factories were not Australians, and I could talk or swear with them in their own language, which at times is most useful.
The workers Sievers met were among thousands of European and British migrants who had only recently arrived on Australian shores.
I was entranced by major ocean liners coming into Sydney, and that was the umbilicus, really, between the motherland, England, and Australia. And we were very closely connected in those days, Australia and England. So I decided to do a story on the entry of a great liner into Sydney Harbour and the time it was in harbour and all the activity that went on there until the day it sailed. At the moment when the ship started to move astern, and the streamers, this wonderful display, finally separated. That was the separation of that ship from Sydney, from Australia, from the people here. And it sowed a seed in me about the desire to travel and to try and find out what was on the other side out there. And I needed a sense of values about Australia. And just at that time, Max Dupain, not aware of my desire to go overseas, offered me a junior partnership in his company. Now, I was torn between staying in Australia, taking up the partnership, or travelling overseas and cutting those ties.
And he went overseas. He's very hot-footed. And I think he spent 7 years. Yes, he did. And it was a great experience for him, and he still has this urge to go over. Well, good luck to him. That's him. I prefer to stay in my own cocoon. I feel that with the light we have here and the wonderful material that's available in Australia, we don't need to go overseas. It's here, under our feet.
Everyone goes to the beach in Sydney, some to swim and some to watch. And who knows, if you're pretty enough and you wait long enough, well, sooner or later, you might catch the eye of a cameraman.
At Bondi, I saw these two figures standing, this great wrestler type and this slender female beside, and I thought, what a beaut contrast. Grabbed the camera, set, just as I was about to shoot, she does this. I couldn't resist it. Here we are at Manly. A surf carnival is obviously in place. It typifies Australia. And I figured at the time that I'd have to go out into the surf, get wet if necessary, and shoot into the mob as it came towards the surf. Did do that, got 4 or 5 shots. This is the only one where we got this marvellous repetition, and that makes it. You have wonderful light quality and dramatic light and shade. On the beach particularly.
London disappointed me, frankly. Coming from Australia, I fought against the quality of light in London. I found it deadening after the brilliance of the Australian light. And I physically disliked it. However, when I finally understood the British light, I found it could be extraordinarily beautiful. That soft, golden, gentle quality, which was so different, and penetrated shadows, so different to the Australian light, where the shadows are black.
And now, Her Majesty leaves the palace. In a moment, with her husband by her side,
she will be driving out on her way to coronation past the biggest and most enthusiastic crowds London has ever known.
The day of the coronation was fantastic. The people were excited by the possibility of the new queen, the new life that was opening up. And I was being assigned to help to bring that across to the public. I found myself in Trafalgar Square just at the point where the royal coach was going to come by.
This was the moment for which so many had patiently waited. Here she comes. Dramatic, thrilling, magnificent.
And suddenly, Weak Sun came out. And as the coach came by, this Weak Sun and the people absolutely intoxicated with waiting all night for their new queen to arrive with a crown in the golden coach came by. That was the picture.
It was the picture which launched Moore's career as a photojournalist. Soon he had regular assignments for a number of prestigious publications, among them Life magazine, Time and The Observer.
Photojournalism has got a very important element of lateral thinking within it. You can have a plan for any situation, any development of a situation, which you can pre-visualize to a certain extent, but you must never get locked into that plan. I could illustrate that perhaps by looking at this picture here of when the Russian leaders, Bulgarin and Khrushchev, came to England in the 50s. In that crowd waiting for Bulgarin and Khrushchev to come out in the car were two boys I spied, and they were carrying toy revolvers. And I figured that just possibly these two boys might raise these guns and point them at the car, because B&K were kind of the baddies. So I placed myself just behind the boys so I could see the car and the boys with the guns. And it worked just like that. And I thought, well, at least I've got a picture out of it. And I was surprised the next week when Life ran this picture in the lead story. And the headline was, "Big Trouble for B&K Ahead."
In the 1950s, photojournalism took Moore to the United States, where he photographed some of its most powerful citizens.
Normally one had 5 minutes with these people for the photography, which gives you a tremendous feeling of apprehension, whether you can do it right. And I was thinking that wouldn't it be nice if I had enough experience to go out on this sort of assignment and really do it with confidence and ability and no feeling of concern, like I thought other great, important photographers were doing, the Life staff men and so on. And I realized eventually that if you ever reach that point, you're finished. The thing is that unless you feel that concern, your performance is not good.
From the experience of humble people, David Moore also made telling images of American life. Realizing that important aspects of life in his own country remained unphotographed, Moore decided to return home.
And I was seeing nothing coming out of Australia in photojournalism that was being used in the rest of the world, and I was, I suppose, nationalistic enough to want to go back to my country and photograph my country and have it used overseas in journals. I hadn't known Australia very well before I went away. I hadn't travelled a great deal in Australia. And so when I came back, I was very fortunate to get a marvellous assignment from Time Life Books to photograph this whole country. And that allowed me to see it north to south, east to west, and a whole lot of detail in the middle.
People who take holidays are less stressed. Go on, get out there. See Australia.
One of the most dangerous places on earth A journey of over 16,000 kilometers. An attempt at 2 world records. Can 4 Aussie blokes be the first to circumnavigate Australia by jet ski? This is about having a go. Austrek, Wednesday at 8:30 on National Geographic Channel. The greatest explorers in a world of adventure are waiting for you to join their ranks. With National Geographic Channel's Explorers Club, turn your passion for exploration into a whole new experience. Register your membership at our award-winning website. Then discover a world of amazing prizes, exclusive information on our explorers, news on our latest projects, green guides, book guides, and a personalised program service. National Geographic Channel's Explorers Club, your passport to an amazing world. Wednesday on National Geographic Channel. We live in a world where technology rules, but deep within the forest of New Zealand, there is a spirit world. Experience the ultimate adventure on skis with 4 ordinary Aussies who set out to achieve the impossible, to circumnavigate Australia in 3 months. Join them as they come face to face with native wildlife as they battle the harsh Australian elements in their quest of a lifetime. The greatest tragedy with natural disasters is that man can't fight back. We can only pray that Mother Nature will be merciful and spare the innocent, so that there is some hope amongst the ruins. And will scientists be in time to save an ancient land from disappearing into a sea of sand? That's Wednesday from 7:30 on National Geographic Channel.
In Melbourne, home to many of Australia's manufacturing workplaces, Wolfgang Sievers' decision to devote himself to industrial photography had brought its rewards. It provided his income whilst allowing him to explore the aesthetic preoccupations which had remained with him since his early photographic days in Germany.
One of those photographs that really show all I have been trying to do in industrial photography. And it started with 2 halves of a big mining gear lying on the floor, most unattractive, in a filthy factory. I spent days trying to think how I'm going to make something out of it. And then had the idea of putting 1 half up on the ground and lifting the other one by a crane over it. To add drama, here comes, again, as I often try to do, bring in the human element. The man that is measuring the quality control. Now that is pure stage, from the first to the last. One has to realize, and I've got to be quite clear about this thing, that an industrial photographer is lying most of the time. And I'm fully aware of that. We're trying to make things look the way they are not. Whether it's in an engineering factory where we're cleaning up everything, machinery is being painted, a lot of it is a plain lie. And I'm quite aware of that. But anyway, it was during the Vietnam War, and as I had made public protests against Australia being involved in the Vietnam War, I lost at that stage 60% of my industrial clients.
In 1966, President Lyndon Johnson was due to take his first visit to Australia to have talks with our Prime Minister, Harold Holt. I was assigned by Life magazine to cover this visit, and the first time that Johnson stepped foot on Australian soil was at Canberra Airport. When Holt went to the microphone to make his welcoming speech, he said in a sort of a hushed tone, he said, he's here, he's finally arrived. And I thought that was a very sycophantic attitude.
And I am honored beyond measure tonight, upon my arrival, to see the cream and flower of your young manhood, who have rendered such gallant and distinguished service in Vietnam, come here to meet me.
Holt was two paces behind, and as he was listening to Johnson, he bowed his head, almost in that attitude of obeisance. And that was my photojournalist's picture. And I think it summed up a lot of things about Australia's attitude to our relationship to the United States.
The late 1960s and early 70s changed the face of Sydney forever. A property boom created a frenzy of buying, selling and building in Australia's oldest city.
Before 1957, city buildings were limited to 150 feet. Prefabrication and building methods weren't as sophisticated as today, but Sydney continued to push out and up.
Well, that, of course, was an era full of optimism. People wanted to see a new world made and encouraged those who had the wherewithal to come up with new images. I think probably the most remarkable result of that era is the Opera House itself, which when I first saw the design, I thought this was a piece of poetry. It was just outstanding, way above anybody else's concept. When it came to portraying it, I think the texture and the form of the Opera House, there's no one who would have done that more brilliantly than Max did.
I took probably 1,000 negatives of the Opera House right from the very start. And they're stored away in the archives in the studio, and, you know, most of them never seen the light of day. Here we have the construction at its last stage. The whole thing is form and texture, and fairly dramatic at that. I think of it as a jewel on the harbour.
I had assignments from Life magazine to photograph the building of the Opera House. And it was a unique construction, very exciting way of putting a building together, which had never been done before. And I found that of great interest photographically, the forms, the shapes, the men working on it. And it was something that you could photograph almost from any angle and make it work for you.
As an interesting exercise, we commissioned both David and Max to take the same building because of, you know, quality of youth and all the rest of it. You know, you wanted both the best photographers to take your work. Anyway, I went up to the building with Max, and Max took about 3 hours to set up, put his big black, you know, hood on, and studied through the lens, and we were, you know, he'd get you to crawl underneath, and you'd look through it, and you'd see this marvellous composition, and he'd have the red filters and the filters going so that the sky was right and everything. And, of course, you get this wonderful still life appearance, you know, this wonderful studied piece of art, of which there was a perfection. I mean, you just couldn't believe that there was a better photograph to take. Max was first, and then David came up second. And David was so gung-ho, he was off the hip, and clicking here and clicking there, and I was a bit puzzled. I thought, well, you know, this is hardly the photographer that I expected. You know, that he was. I thought he'd be much more studied like Max, but he then explained to me that his view of architecture and photographing architecture was one of the everyday experience, and that he should truthfully portray architecture as the observer would have it.
It's very important for an architect to see the reality of his buildings translated into a beautiful form in 2 dimensions. For that to be dispersed in the community means being printed in books and magazines. When this happens, on a worldwide basis, photography can be the very source of an architect's reputation, international reputation. And I was fortunate enough to enjoy that, largely through the images that Max produced of our buildings.
In the late 1970s, a new Australian embassy was built in Paris. Its architect, Harry Seidler, took Max Dupain to France to photograph his work.
We had photographed the building maybe for 3 or 4 days. And the one image that he likes to show of the building, which I think is the best picture ever taken of it, is a picture that I disagreed with. You know, and that sort of shows, you know, the interaction that goes on between an architect and a photographer. I tend to be there because you think you know where your building looks best. And he looks at this and says, yeah, but I don't know, I think from here it's better. Or sometimes he doesn't even ask you, he just takes the camera somewhere else and takes what he sees in it.
It was a marvelous assignment to do, and I spent a week on it, and then I spent a fortnight on my own in Paris. The funny thing is that I photographed assiduously the whole time, and I really didn't discover Paris until I got back and processed the film.
Australia's mineral reserves became the nation's new wealth and Wolfgang Sievers' photographic resource in the 1960s and 70s. Turning his back on industry, Sievers aimed his camera at recently discovered deposits of iron ore, nickel, bauxite and oil.
So you come into a mine deep underground, and you're supposed to show a glamorous, beautiful mine with wonderful ore. When you get there, it's all gray and not a single damn color. What I did then is bring my own lighting equipment down and started coloring the thing the way that it would be attractive. Not realistic, but attractive. My main commissions were for annual reports, and from a practical point of view, that meant I had to show industry as beautiful as possible, pollution-free, everything clean and wonderful. The question of environment and pollution and all these things has increasingly worried me over the years. It's again one of those incredible things that the worse it got, the nearer I got to the end of my active days as a photographer.
Your mission, if you choose to accept it, is to hang about wherever necessary. To get the bad guys. To be a big sook at all times. To fetch all sorts of stuff. To make a fool of yourself on command. To play mum, even when it makes no sense. This mission will take place tonight at 7 on National Geographic Channel. Good luck, dogs with jobs.
Since Cathay Pacific introduced their new business class, people on the ground are trying to make themselves as comfortable as they were in the air.
Who'll defend Hamida when the military uses rape as a weapon of war? Who'll defend Shanti when families can murder a girl for refusing a marriage? You can defend them. Become an Amnesty International human rights defender from just $30 a month. Your regular donation helps Amnesty International defend women's rights as human rights, investigate, campaign and pressure governments to expose abuses. It takes eternal vigilance.
A face known to millions around the world. An Afghan girl haunted by war. For 18 years, she has had no name. Until now. Join National Geographic photographer Steve McCurry as he hunts for the girl who changed his life forever. Search for the Afghan Girl, an exclusive premiere tomorrow at 8:30, only on National Geographic Channel.
Like Wolfgang Sievers, David Moore's feeling for the natural environment has had its effect on his work. Many of his recent photographs are land or seascapes, and they are among his most eloquent images of Australia.
I just loved that movement and the drama and the awesome power of the ocean was expressed so clearly down there. And I like that point when the wave changed from being a swell to a breaking wave. That line, that curve, top of the wave, just before it crashed in. The sea is also ever-changing, and it's got a fascination because of that. It can be absolutely tranquil, or it can be terrifyingly violent. That contrast has always drawn me. I think that we had a great tradition in this country of very fine photography of the land, almost since the invention of photography, 1850s, 60s, 70s. Through the 19th century, there were superb images made. All I can hope is that my photography of the land is within that tradition and perhaps will help people to understand the land more in the future so we can look after it.
What I finally came to produce photographs of this oil rig done at night time from a swaying boat in a fairly vigorous sea. We were there for 3 nights waiting for and hoping for test firing. Finally it happened, and it turned out into one of the most dramatic and wonderful scenes you could ever have. As a lightning flames was like a grand finale of a fantastic dramatic opera. I couldn't go any further. It was such a high point that after that everything became flat. And I decided that this would be a halt to all I had done. And I have now concentrated on doing exhibitions. Most of all, I have been invited to by the state museums in Berlin, in Germany, the city I came from originally, to have a great exhibition in memory of my family, the fate of a family that started there in 1804, to my father, to me finally that had to leave the country, and now, in the full circle, goes back to show what I've been trying to achieve in Australia.
Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge Max Dupain, to whom I've dedicated this book. Max is really the master of light when it comes to photography, and that's what we live on, light, as photographers, as you all know. In the 40s, I was very fortunate to work with Max, and he taught me for a matter of 3 years. So if there's elements of Max Dupain's work in my pictures, that's fine, I acknowledge it. It's my homage to him.
My philosophy has been that everything we need is in this country, photographically speaking. And it's sort of surmounted by the marvelous light we have. if your life is uncomplicated, that flows through to your work, without a doubt. You'll see that most of my stuff is of very simple origin and simply composed.
There we are.
Come in.
Hello.
Hi. Hi. How are you?
Well, look at
Hello, my name is Min.
Yeah, I remember you.
Sievers, how are you? And the other one?
Where you been all this time?
Wonderful. Oh, I've been hiding away, you know.
Yeah.
And you are finally here. Wonderful. Wonderful.
Now, I'm here.
Right.
If you could just tuck in there when the leg goes that way. Yeah.
Where are you shooting from? The knees up?
Yeah.
Tight, is it?
Tight here, coming through there.
You got to watch these photographers. Eh?
Sure.
Don't you not? Almost 60 years of taking photographs. My God, what an incredible period of the 20th century you have lived through.